All right, today we're with Dr. Emily Chamlee-Wright. Dr. Wright is professor of economics at Beloit College, and today she was at Rockford College to speak to the Business and Economic Ethics class on the topic of the reconstruction efforts in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Dr. Chamlee-Wright has done some work on development and entrepreneurship in sub-Saharan Africa, and there are some connections to the problems with redevelopment in New Orleans. In New Orleans, a scene of great devastation. How bad was it immediately after Hurricane Katrina?
You have to realize that there was 80% of the city was underwater, and some communities were submerged with a surge from levee breaches, and because of the topography of the city itself, once water gets into neighborhoods, until it's pumped out, it stays there. So it in essence is something like a bowl, and so once the water came in, houses were suffering the effects of standing water for weeks on end after the initial storm.
All right, so it's quite terrible. But then you mentioned in your talk that despite the devastation, there were some success stories. You mentioned, for example, Doris Vautier and the efforts to get schools up and running fairly quickly. How did that work out?
This is in St. Bernard Parish. It's the parish just adjacent to Orleans Parish, but
okay.
It's just a stone's throw away. And it's a community, the entire community is surrounded on three sides by water, and it suffered storm surges of up to 20 feet, and it was under 8 feet of water, standing water, for 3 weeks. This is a community that there was only about 4 buildings in the entire parish that were not flooded. So
wow.
This is a complete devastation of the entire parish. It was very clear to Doris Vautier, who's the superintendent of St. Bernard Schools, that if she was going to be able to have a police force and first responders available, she would have to find a place for the kids to go to school,
right.
for their kids to go to school. She made a pledge that anyone who signed up on November 1st, this is just the November 1st following the storm, 2005, anyone who signed up at the November 1st registration, they would find a place for their children and they would be able to go to school.
Nice.
She made this pledge thinking that maybe 50 students would sign up. Instead, there were more than 700 students who signed up. This acted as a tipping point for many within the community to say, okay, if this one thing is solved, a place to send my kids to school, right. then I can come back.
Okay, good. So that entrepreneurial initiative by Doris Vautier was a key success story
yes.
in that neighborhood. You also mentioned the Vietnamese community, which, despite being scattered after the hurricane and the devastation, nonetheless regrouped and came back in large numbers. How did that come about?
Well, it was a very interesting story because they were scattered to various evacuation sites around the country. Trying to get them woven back together was quite difficult. Father Vien Nguyen of Mary Queen of Vietnam Catholic Church would go from site to site visiting with neighborhood-based lay leaders within the church, and they were already orchestrating their return before they were even officially given notice that they would be allowed to return. They were orchestrating their plan to get the most able-bodied people who could go in and start rebuilding. And the first thing they did is rebuild the church, because that was the critical signal to the city as well as to other people who were wondering, is this community going to come back or not? By having the church repaired, Father Vien could credibly signal this community is coming back. And so that served as a very important sort of social entrepreneurial story.
Okay. So Doris Vautier and Father Nguyen, two entrepreneurial individuals, social entrepreneurship in this case, who were keys to right. the first steps to rebuilding. You also focused on and mentioned the importance of big box stores and commercial activity with the Walmarts, the Home Depots, the Rite Aid store as absolutely being essential as well.
Right.
How did that play out?
Yeah, you don't think about a big church and a big box store as serving a similar kind of function,
right.
but in a post-disaster environment, there's very similar roles that they can serve. First of all, they can come back and, just as the church provided the material supplies that were needed for people who were coming back and was a place where food could be found, Similarly, the box stores were that source of material supplies that were absolutely necessary in the post-disaster moment. The other similarity is they acted as a signal that the community was worth reinvesting. So if you're a small business owner, the fact that you see a Walmart come back is a very clear sign to you that somebody's reinvesting in this community, and maybe I can make a go of it as well.
Okay. Now, despite these kinds of success stories, and there were any number of them in New Orleans, overall New Orleans is not making the progress that we would have expected. And in your talk, you mentioned there have been other cities that have suffered great disasters, the earthquake in San Francisco, Chicago's Great Fire, the fact that Berlin was devastated after World War II. But nonetheless, those communities had a kind of resilience, and fairly quickly they were back to business and back to culture as usual. Why is New Orleans, in fact, going down a different path? Why have things been so much slower there?
Yeah, I think that a critical part of the problem is that a lot of our public policy, even that kind of public policy that was aimed at helping, ended up not helping. So, for example, in the Lower Ninth Ward, one of the things that understandably people wanted to protect the safety of people going in. A lot of the structures were more unsound. The idea was if we keep people out of the community, maybe there won't be as much looting. But in fact, by not allowing those early pioneers to go back and suffer the costs of returning early, those early pioneers weren't able to send the signals out to people who were waiting on the sidelines, hey, that this is a community that could be rebuilt, that there's a great deal of investment, emotional investment as well as physical investment, material investment in this community. Those signals couldn't get sent. And actually, rather than deterring looting, the fact that you had an empty neighborhood made it very easy prey for further damage to be done. So standing water that was still there, it couldn't get brushed out, and that just erodes the materials even worse. Empty neighborhoods become easy prey for looters to come in and cut out the copper pipes underneath the houses. The copper piping would have been fine after the storm, but because the looters were able to come in, it ended up creating even more damage than was there.
Another contrast you made was in the case of the social entrepreneurs and other entrepreneurs and the big retailers coming in, that they were then showing initiative and starting to build New Orleans up from the bottom, right, so to speak. That in many cases there was a top-down bureaucratic structure in place that, as you say, was trying to help, but in many cases had the unintended consequence of frustrating or placing obstacles in the place of the people who were showing initiatives. Was that a systematic problem, or was it an occasional problem?
I think it was a systematic problem. The systematic part of it came from the idea that the redevelopment planning process was taken as an opportunity to completely redesign the city, and not just in a physical sense, but in a sense of here's our opportunity to fix all that was wrong with New Orleans before. And I understand the temptation of that the post-disaster moment is the time to, start everything fresh. The problem is that planning process, even if it works perfectly, is going to take years and years and years. And the fact of the matter is it doesn't work perfectly. And it gets scrapped and it gets politicized, and it just puts off the day when certainty comes, when the rules of the game will now be certain about, what are my property rights here? What are the rules of the game with regard to rebuilding? With the uncertainty that in many cases still prevails, people are likely to wait on the sidelines, and that's the kind of distortion that I think is built into a paradigm that says, let's look at rebuilding a city as a kind of top-down effort rather than something that taps the dispersed, decentralized assets, both material and social assets that are embedded within communities.
Okay. Disasters are going to happen again. So based on your studies in New Orleans and the lessons there, what should cities in preparation for disaster have in place or not have in place to ensure that the recoveries go more efficiently next time?
One of the things that I think is concerning is that there is the great sense that it is the city's responsibility to make sure that, say, everybody evacuates. And we saw this with Gustav after just this last hurricane season. One of the things that's concerning about that is that I'm pretty sure that, especially with another 1, 2, 3 missed, we dodged that bullet sort of situations, people are going to start saying, I'm not going to evacuate, I'm not going to get out. And I think that's perfectly reasonable, because people are oftentimes staying behind because they want to protect their property. So rather than fight that, I think that one of the things we need to recognize is that that's a very human and natural response. And so if there are able-bodied people who can withstand difficult circumstances, rather than fighting these folks, we might want to try and find ways to help them. And that would be a shift in paradigms, which is a very difficult thing to turn in terms of public policy.
All right. Well, it's a fascinating set of issues. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much.